والآن مع الجلسة الحادية عشر، والتي هي بعنوان دور الإبداع والثقافة في تطوير المدن، وهي برئاسة مايكل بريك كبير المصممين بشركة هينينغ لارسن الاستشارية كوبنهاجن and رياض.
Thank you very much. I must say it's a really big pleasure to be here and to participate in the first international conference on humanizing cities, and to host this talk, which I think will be one of the really interesting talks of the day. I'm really looking forward to it. I will just do a very brief introduction and then hand over the seat to our keynote speaker, and then after his talk there should be still time for some questions before lunch, hopefully, if we hurry up a little. My name is Mikkel Bræk. I'm an architect from Denmark. I work as the lead designer in Henning Larsen in our Saudi Arabian office in Riyadh. We are a Danish company that are one of the really global companies from Denmark that work all over the world and spread out in 7 different offices. But we have worked also in Riyadh and in Saudi Arabia for many years. Had an office here for the last 10 years and worked in many scales, but also a lot in urban development and in city master planning. The latest and biggest one being the King Abdullah Financial District in Riyadh, where we did the master plan and also did 7 projects within that master plan. So I would say I'm representing some of these architects that actually try to work with cities in the region and that try to work creatively. But for me, the creativity is really something that is very much for the architects, at least in a common sense. You know, we can say that we handle the problems creatively, or we approach a thing, it can be approached that we try to think out of the box when we design, but how can we think about creativity in a wider perspective and actually apply it to the thinking we're doing about developing cities? We're going to hear more about that from Charles today, and I'm really looking forward to that. He is one of the heavyweights within his field. He has written several books on the topic of creating cities. The most famous ones being The Art of the City and the Creative City. He's the founder of Comedia and also a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. So please give a very warm welcome for Mr. Charles Landry.
Well, what a pleasure to be here. You're all here, which is wonderful. It was great this morning. I got here at about 5 o'clock, and to see the sunrise in the mosque was quite a special experience. So I just want to talk about what I think is quite central. And my argument is that culture determines a place, what it is, and creativity shapes its life. And that, of course, sounds very simple, but I'd like to just repeat that sentence. Culture determines places, creativity shapes its life. And in that sense, it is like the air we breathe or the oxygen which makes a place work. And of course, as we all know, culture is who we are, but also it determines and shapes what we can become. And that, of course, will be different in every place around the world. And that question of distinctiveness is obviously key. And of course, here it is different in Saudi Arabia than elsewhere. But one of the issues that I think is quite important is also to be aware that we can sometimes close the culture in, and rather like it says here, danger museum, that we just put it all into a museum and do not connect it to that creative source, which is about curiosity, imagination, inventiveness, innovation, and other things like that. But importantly, in city making, culture is not the default mechanism. It's not the key thing that when you're looking at a planning department or a strategic body of a city, the cultural heart is often not there. It's often the engineer, it's often other disciplines and so on. And all of these are important disciplines, but I believe there is a lack there. Creativity, and this sentence has taken me 30 years to work out, creativity is a renewable resource, and we all want renewable resources that re-emerge, refresh themselves and so on. And heritage is in some sense non-renewable. Of course, heritage can be reinterpreted, but I think it's quite interesting to see that apparent tension between creativity as a renewable resource and heritage as potentially non-renewable. So let's look at that a bit more closely. In some sense, both of those are the equivalent, if you want to use economic terms, they're a bit like a currency. But what's interesting is that for me, heritage and creativity are wonderful partners. And some of the most interesting projects we've discussed yesterday and today are really this layering of the past and the present and the potential future mixing up together. So they're not necessarily in contradiction. So whatever that heritage is, and obviously there's hundreds of heritage here, laying over that some sort of sense of imagination, I think is an interesting thing. And this is just an image of an event, a series of events I was in Paris, discussing the future of a whole part of Paris. And isn't it interesting that, of course, it's in an old building. Now, today's classic, that thing that we now think is heritage, was often yesterday's innovation, which is why we've made it into something we regard as heritage. So this just is the Eiffel Tower, of course, that was incredibly innovative in its engineering sense. Next to it is a hydroponic building, which of course is very modern and innovative in today's sense. So that idea of today's classic might have been yesterday's innovation is also useful to think through. So that can apply to mosques, it can apply to all sorts of things, buildings and so on. Now, the best cultural strategies, if you're thinking about cultural strategy and incorporating it in the city fabric and the way the city works, is to think of it having 5 elements, perhaps. It enables enlightenment, it has an empowering effect, it can be, of course, entertainment, and it often, of course, is about work. People are working, there are jobs there, but it often has these other impacts, these economic impacts, obviously, but social and other interesting impacts that are very significant for the life of the city. Now, going with the grain of culture, of course, is absolutely essential, but I do think we have to be aware that there's some aspects of our own culture, I could speak of European culture, British culture, which are negative, which should equally be reviewed. But the interesting point is, it's really, we often talk, Adam Smith says, the invisible hand of the market. I think the way things are guided is through the invisible hand of culture. And in that sense, it's part of our DNA. It is the DNA of how things work. Now, apart from people wanting jobs and some work, from all the people I've ever discussed in my life about what's a great city, 5 things come to me very strongly. And they are that people want anchorage, the familiar, something that they know. You could call it tradition, heritage, whatever. They want possibility. They want can-do. They want choices, options. They want to make more of themselves than they are. They want connection physically, being able to get into places locally, but also globally, and into the wider world. But they also, the 4th thing I think, is they want aspiration, they want personal growth, being more and becoming the best they can be, and then they want inspiration. Inspiration changes, perhaps it's the mosque, but it can also be, as some people say, people say in Europe sometimes, art galleries and museums are the cathedrals of the post-industrial age. So that question of the past, that we remember, is incredibly important, but it has to be linked to these other opportunities where we can gather together, interact, all the things that we've been saying over the last day, which ranges from that just meeting and playing, but also the essence of a city, of course, is exchange, trade, and all of those things. But the example I'm just giving of, in this case, connection and inspiration and aspiration is a library, an ordinary library that was just redone a bit in Rio de Janeiro, which inside had people making things, doing things, connecting over different ages and different social groups. And then, of course, inspiration. This happens to be in Muscat, but it could be, you will know what your own inspiration is. It could be, of course, a cultural centre too. Now, if we look at the future, what are the sort of really interesting big questions? Every city is asking themselves the question, how do I blend nature into the city again? How do I get rid of or soften the environment that feels so harsh and hard and feels so inhuman? So every city that is thinking ahead knows they have to do that, and that's why I think this conference is so wonderful. But actually to do it requires a degree of courage, because so much of the systems, those who might be in power and the interest groups, are pushing things so often in a different direction. So it's easy to say, let's humanize the city. It's actually difficult to do. And one of the big issues for me, and it's one of my personal obsessions at the moment, is where do we belong, or where do I belong, when everything is on the move? Let's just look at that. Where do I belong? Where do we belong when everything is on the move? When everything is moving faster, quicker, where the world fragments to some extent. And I've tried to summarize that in something I'm interested in, a book called The Civic City in a Nomadic World. So the civic, this old-fashioned word about how do we come together and bond in a world that is in movement. This is a picture of Quito in the Habitat event, which talked about the future of cities and said cities are the engines or the places where the solutions will be found. But there are quite a lot of people there, perhaps too many. And that, I believe, this too many people has a psychological effect, which comes out in many ways that sometimes are unexpected and sometimes quite negative. I'm not saying you need to do that, but I'm just saying there are things in one's mind that sometimes are unpredictable. So this growth of cities actually is also a psychological thing, because our perception, our first moment of a city is all about emotions, perceiving something. How do we feel through the senses? And I think this dimension should be taken into consideration. And in that sense, as Patrick Geddes, a famous old urbanist many years ago, said, a city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time. And I think very much this morning revealed this sentence to me. A city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time. And I love this advert I saw long ago in Dubai when I was doing something there, and that just revealed to me this drama that was going on there. And the question obviously for you here in Saudi Arabia is to say, what are we going to learn from Dubai? What did they do well? What did they do badly? How can we do it better in a way that is relevant to who you are? And in that sense, being alert and learning for this is really important. Now, the big issue, of course, is that the world, and we experience it in my region, is turning to its darker face. Apprehension is in the air. The zeitgeist is one of rising anxiety. We know that, you know that. And really, these are the issues that provide the context for the life in the cities we live in. And of course, this is partly driven by the massive changes we all know in the economy and everything else, but also disagreements between people and nations and so on. But when the world becomes a smaller place, these things come closer to us all the time. They're much closer than they ever were before. And that's what creates some of these feelings of uncertainty. So therefore we can see, this is Istanbul, the world is in motion. The city is continually in motion because it's being rethought, rebuilt. As I drove in this morning, I could see buildings being torn down, new buildings being built up, cranes everywhere, and so on. And so the question is, where are the zones of encounter? And we've discussed already these zones of encounter. But zones of encounter, the city, and particularly hubs within the city, your mosque, your whatever else, could be another thing, it could be a park, are incredibly essential because that is the neutral territory potentially where the differences meet in a way that they can be together. And then the challenge, of course, is out of that to create places of empathy. I'm not saying we should all love each other or anything like that, but at least coexist in a way that we can move forward with the place we live in. One word I didn't hear today, of course, in that context, is the power of these third places, which may be the place where you have coffee. It may be these incidental places. There are 3 or 4 outside our hotel. But third places, often a library or something, where people can work, which is neither home nor an office, increasingly are one of the central places and spaces that we need. So again, let's look at this more closely. This nomadic world, if you just observe, this happens to be Sydney, if you observe the world, you see people, and I don't know what they're exactly doing, but I think these people are just sitting there somewhere and working. So this is a different world. This is not necessarily the world of the typical office, but this is also the world where the other people... Do I then stop? You tell me what I do.
I think you can continue.
I continue? Okay. All right, thank you. So obviously people, young people, are moving from cities, leaving cities. And so across the world, there are as many growing cities as shrinking cities. And the question of those cities which are gathering everyone, the big cities, the riads, is what happens to the smaller cities? What do those feel like? And these old and new nomads, you see everywhere. This happens to be Berlin. People are trying to move around. Students want to take a year out, travel somewhere and so on. And there are these lifestyles which sometimes people think are a bit hypish, where this woman perhaps is negotiating some contract. But it's interesting, this picture I took in Vancouver, I don't know if you can see that man's bag says Roots. I just think it's a coincidence. There he is, working somewhere, but his bag says Roots. So that question of the locality and the global together is really one of the central issues for us to deal with. But the other movements are the 80 million migrants in the world that have left, escaped from war and so on. Then of course there are migrant workers here in the UAE and everywhere else. All of these people are in movement, and that creates an element of instability. But there are also students in movement. Millions of students are moving around from one place to the next, and often changing the whole relationship to their own original place of living, which again challenges the identity of a person. And then of course the millions of tourists. And so often those tourists are moving perhaps for health reasons, for other reasons. But one thing is sure, that the buses they travel on all seem to look the same. These are buses from 4 continents, but it's all the same bus. So the promise of globalization that was difference and diversity is often sameness, just like Coca-Cola. 30 million outlets in the world, 38,000 McDonald's, 42,000 subways. So there is a danger in this globalization, which in a sense makes everything the same, and so the cities look the same too. And then the products that are moving, shipping, logistics, more goods is traveling for more places more of the time. And of course, money is moving in nanoseconds. And of course, this is from a southern place in Italy, crime is moving. If you look at tracked crime across the world, it's moving in all sorts of places, the mafias of Russia and Italy and other places, Mexico. And of course, pollution is moving itself. So this question of movement is one of the things that we really have to take into account when we talk about the character, the personality, the identity of a place. And people can even move their own citizenship. Cyprus is the cheapest place to buy a new citizenship in Europe. Dominican Republic is the cheapest in the world. And of course, there is the movement of language. Of course, it's good that English can be spoken in many places across the world. But at the same time, it reduces that issue of diversity, because then we don't understand perhaps the richness of the Arab language or German language or Russian language and so on. But perhaps the most dramatic movement is the movement of reality. The virtual and the real world blending in some new ways. I took this picture outside Dublin Library, and it says here, as you can see, we spend more time in our virtual world than in our own world often. And this effect, this powerful effect of digitization and the social media related to it is immersive. And there is a lot of knowledge, as you probably know, of the addictive qualities of smartphones, which draws us deeper and deeper in to these devices. But it's a breakthrough in many other ways, as you know, because it's enabling the fourth industrial revolution, if you want to call it that. But it has these monopoly companies that do a lot of stuff which is potentially good, but as we know, potentially bad. And this is the Sydney Biennale, but this Google train, and I'm using this as a metaphor, is sucking people in. And every time we say yes to cookies, someone has more information about us, and our private sphere is in a sense reduced in one way or another. But we can't hide from big data. And this big data will, of course, give us many opportunities, which I'm sure you've thought about in terms of things like smart cities and so on. But when you think of the fact that the biggest hotel chain in the world, Airbnb, has no hotel rooms, when the biggest taxi company in the world, Uber, owns no taxis of its own, when the biggest media producer in the world, Facebook, has none of its own media, then you know the world has changed disruptively. But at the same time, certainly in Europe and America and Australia, and I don't know what the situation is here, it's enabled all sorts of sharing schemes, from bikes to cars to vans to many, many other things. So that's the plus side of some of these developments. And of course, all enabled through a smartphone. Now that we can call a paradigm shift, and that word was raised earlier today at one moment. So therefore I ask, the fixed, what's the fixed? That which we are in an age of the flexible and the fluid. What is the fixed in an age of the flexible and the fluid? And for many young people, of course, all of this is incredibly exciting and invigorating, but for others it feels threatening, and they're not sure what they should think. They feel defensive, they close in. And as I said earlier, we walk faster, we eat faster, we probably think faster, I'm not sure. And that means this question of contemplation, which came up today earlier, is incredibly important. Where do we find and give ourselves the time for contemplation? And what it reminds us too, this speed of movement and all of that, is the fragility, which is why I come back to this question of these 5 points I said at the beginning, one of which was anchorage. Where are we anchored when everything is on the move? And in other words, as you know, we are in the midst of redesigning the world and all its systems, legally, intellectual property rights, socially, economically, culturally, etc. You know that. And the question is, what is that vision? And obviously the vision is less just doing what we always did, but having a human-centered approach to development. And if we want to just very simplistically look at these developments and see the trajectory of where we come from and where we're going, you could say there's a city 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. I'm just being simplistic. And your city, historic city, is 0.0. This is your mosque in this image that you can't see perhaps. But the 1.0 city is very much that city that started from the 60s onwards, which is very hardware driven. Those who control the hardware are in charge. They are the decision makers at the top about that. And that has implications. And Dubai is quite a hardware city in a way. It was probably built too quickly as well, too much speed and not enough slowness. But it's also the place, the hardware city, perhaps makes people feel they live in containers and warehouses and things like that. And that has a cultural version as well. The cultural repertoire of that is, in Europe, classic institutions, which this picture seems to have disappeared. Oh, here it is, which might look like that 80, 100 years ago, and today might look something else. But many people said, this hardware city, there must be a plan B. There must be another way of thinking about that. And that's where we have to bring the words hard and soft together. So it's about soft placemaking, I would say, is what we're talking about then. And that is about understanding how do you feel the city, back to that psychological, emotional point, and saying, therefore, communicating with the residents, of course, who feel perhaps the city is too harsh and hard. And these priorities came very much in the 2.0 approach to city making, as did the smart city idea and related ideas. And the cultural version of that was obviously historic culture, museums, galleries, all of that, but also the creative economy sectors, web design, music, all of these things coming together. So these seem to be the priorities of the 2.0 city. But it also was the city that built the iconic buildings and tried to create icons. Easy to talk about icons, very difficult to create buildings that represent that, and this, of course, is Bilbao. But it's also the period in time where these third spaces, where people work in different contexts and environments, becomes much more significant than ever before. This is actually more an office than a cafe. But what is City 3.0 about? And there'll be a City 4.0 and 5.0. Someone will always add a number to all of these things. The 3.0 one is really where we're here, there, at the same time, simultaneously. We understand all of those complexities. We try to work them through. And this City and Culture 3.0 requires a different physical form, and some of that has been discussed today. It's softer, it's greener, it makes you feel as a human being that you're not overwhelmed by the structures. It makes you feel close, it makes you feel at ease with yourself and nearer to that point of feeling whole. But it also is a city that has a different management and operating dynamics, because this is a city that is more co-creative, that has more community involvement and more engagement, because it realizes that that process actually leads to resilience, even though sometimes it's all a bit difficult and seems to take a long time, that community engagement. But what that city then tries to do, that 3.0, is combine the best of the village feel, that sense of intimacy and closeness, with that sense of being part of a bigger world, of being part of that cosmopolitan world, but still anchored in place. And so this city is really one where you can ask that question. This is an event in Amsterdam where people are saying, what are you bringing, what are you contributing as citizens to your city? And then another way of looking at this great rethinking through time, if you think about it, was really the battle for distinctiveness. That has already happened today. I kept on hearing that word, distinctiveness, in a globalizing world. What is that in a globalizing world? And of course, that is about identity. Now, what that is will differ. This is, our next speaker is from Bahrain, and this is Bahrain. So these issues are obviously identity issues, where they're rebuilding in certain interesting ways. But let's just look at something else. The other thing that's happening in this world, of course, is more and more Louis Vuittons and all of that. That's fine, but not too many, perhaps. More and more of the same brands and so on. But this is Venice, okay. Many of you will have been there. This is Venice. This is a fashion model in Venice, okay. That's the real Venice. This is the real Venice with adverts, because you have them pay for the refurbishment of the building. But this is a copy of Venice in Las Vegas. And this is a copy of Venice in Macau. And this is another copy of Venice in Macau. And this is the Grand Canal, which in Venice is a canal. But this is the third floor of a hotel where you, in a boat, can travel in a gondola on the third floor through the copy of Venice. And it's a certain sort of experience. It's a shopping experience, in fact. And then you get back to Venice. And you arrive at the station in Venice, and you see a copy of Venice. I'm only using that as a way of saying how important distinctiveness is. Another version of that is Soho. Soho, south of Houston Street in New York, but also Soho in London. So people think Soho sounds cool. So everywhere is being called Soho. The Soho Coffee Company, the Soho Travel Agency in Italy. And of course, because we're in Beijing, it's the Soho Galaxy, the biggest Soho there can ever be. Now, interestingly, is the fake okay? Is the real so important? And here, of course, is Dubai, that's Egypt. Is that okay? Perhaps it is. But what is interesting here, this is Doha, Qatar's souk, which was taken down and rebuilt. But it is the most popular place. It is the meeting place in that city. And I think it's very well done. And you could say, well, yes, it was good that they recreated it out of nothing and made it sort of what it was, but just better quality and new. But of course, we have the Coca-Cola sign in there as well. But that raises an interesting question. So what then came after this focus, what people thought about distinctiveness, how can we be distinctive, was obviously the shift to urban design and rethinking aesthetics, how urban design could actually look. So this is Malaga. Malaga is hot in Spain, so this shaded area, I think, looks quite elegant. This is the airport entrance to Adelaide, where you can see the sort of aboriginal type of design there with the Western linear lines around it. So it's a good balance, perhaps, between what its historic heritage is and what it is today. But once that was achieved in the cities in Europe and America and so on, which were trying to push themselves forward and become more prominent, they said that once we do that as the platform, we then have to say and show that we are a cultured city. We are a city full of culture, which was a whole process in the last 30 years of revaluing the cultural experience and valuing the contribution, for example, of creativity of artists. Of course, there are other forms of creativity, social creativity, business creativity, and bureaucratic creativity in principle too. But on that basis of a good urban infrastructure and then this cultural stuff, then people said, then we can become the city of knowledge, because the experience of the city is satisfying, there's activity, then that will attract the people who want to make knowledge, create knowledge, to be there. And in that sense, the city then can become a bit like a campus. And then the final thing, certainly in my region, is that people have said these elements are the elements that encourage the whole new startup movement that you know that exists in many places around the world, where you're encouraging young people to develop their own companies, to rethink and to create apps or whatever, but to become real economic contributors. And this is Helsinki, of course, the sauna, the startup sauna. So that's a bit of a flow of another one of these movements. I was saying 1, 2, 3, but this is another way of looking at that same process of development, but of course very simplified. And here in this startup culture, you can either have these sort of structures. This is a startup company field place, which is one thing. But what's very noticeable, and I don't know if in the Arab world you will want to do this, is that many of these startup environments are precisely, as you know, in old industrial settings. Like this is the old Philips factory in Eindhoven, which has been turned into one of these places. But this is in fact Berlin, and you know how crazy Berlin can be, where this is a startup type place, which looks completely different. I'm only showing you these contrasts because there are alternatives of doing this. But this is a bank. This is the main bank in Antwerp, the big port in Belgium, which the bank has given away all its lower ground floor to people to set up their own businesses where normally the banking hall was. And if you want to go to the bank, you go up a lift 5 floors. This is the headquarters of the Deutsche Bank in Berlin. When you go inside there, there's a meditation room, there's a startup center, and to get to the banking facilities, you have to go deep inside the building. So even banks are realizing that the world is changing. So what we're trying to do here, and I think what you're trying to do, and I think what we perhaps all try to do, is to balance the ordinary with the extraordinary. I think that too often we're trying to make things all extraordinary. So much of urban life is ordinary. Ordinary in the best sense of the word. Because doing things like just having a coffee and watching the world go by is fantastic. So ordinary housing, an ordinary street with ordinary shops, with a bit of diversity as you wander along, is good enough. We don't often always need to have something spectacular, but sometimes we do. So balancing the ordinary and the extraordinary is, I think, quite important. I just was showing this when this was being built in Dubai, but that front building is perhaps ordinary, and the thing at the back, the Khalifa Tower, extraordinary. But the ordinary could just be this setting in Abu Dhabi. That's ordinary, but incredibly satisfactory. So, this challenge is really how to put the human perspective center stage, which is obviously about human scale. So, does the building hang over me, or does it let me just look at it and feel calm about it? And then we have to ask, what is the role of culture and cultural institutions in that? And that's just only one element of a bigger story. And I think the role of the cultural institutions for me, and this is just the new metro being built in Berlin, is to bring us together. To bring us together in our differences. I feel that's the most important thing. My parents escaped from Germany. They're not Jewish, but they were, they were anti-Hitler. They escaped. I was then brought up in England, in Germany, and in Italy. So my mind, I find it very difficult not to be a person who's trying to bring differences together and to create some sort of sense of understanding. Which is why I thought it was wonderful after the Paris outrages that the Imam of Antwerp, the Jewish rabbi and the Catholic priest were all together signing the book. And that was that moment when I saw that, I thought that was fantastic. But culture, of course, is the activities, and they will be different here than perhaps what Fred described. Every setting will have its own form of activities. But sometimes when I look at this, I'm not sure that this is the role of that culture. I think this is a bit tacky. It's not my thing. Or is this good? I'm not sure. But I think it's interesting to ask these questions. For me, the main role of these cultural institutions is, again, to these 5 points I said at the beginning: to connect us, to inspire us, to enlighten us, to anchor us, and so on. And you can build new institutions. I think this is Arts Electronica. It would be very interesting to, in Medina, have this. This is the MIT of Europe. There's a research center in here, but it's a museum of incredibly modern stuff. And inside there, experiments are made on the latest technology, but it's also a modern museum. It's not really a museum, it's something that is an experience of what can happen. And perhaps it's this sort of thing that might be built in Medina. But overall, what I think I'm saying as I draw conclusions is I'm most interested in places and cities that create opportunities for the civic to unfold. And I think one of the priorities of future creativity is civic creativity, a form of creativity where the public domain, the public interest, is working with other partners to find interesting solutions, to bring people together, to bring differences together. And differences will be different, of course, in every place around the world. And perhaps because I'm so obsessed with this question of how difference comes together, I'm saying a lot about that. So where does that leave us, finally? It's really recovering the lost art of urbanism. Because what we're talking about today, words like mixed use, mixing, all of these things, distinctiveness and all of that, we already had that in many, many places, and I'm sure you will have had it in all your towns and cities in Saudi Arabia in the past. But we've lost knowledge, we've forgotten knowledge. I remember being in Mumbai. Mumbai was mentioned, and I kept on thinking you had all these building forms where you never needed in the past air conditioning because there were all these vents to create wind and so on that cooled buildings. But of course now they don't use that anymore. And so what I think is really that we need a new contract between all the parties that are operating in the city. And I'm showing this picture of Bologna, which is where I studied, which, by the way, is the oldest European university. And they have an agreement, the Bologna Declaration of 2014, which is a contract, effectively, of the citizens and the city in its various forms coming together to jointly co-manage and co-create their city. So the conclusion for me, and these 5 words took me again 30 years to work out: the soft is the hard. The hardware stuff is easy. Doing the buildings is easy. It's this softer stuff that blends people together, that makes people feel good with each other, that is really hard. And I think that needs a higher priority and status. And what that requires is to be more open than closed, more willing to listen to the other, more willing to not work in one silo, more willing to share across departments, to share across sectors, and so on, and some way jointly making the decisions together. And that requires a creative bureaucracy. And a creative bureaucracy is a bureaucracy that is open enough to find themselves at ease with all the parties that they may connect with. And that may require changing the rules, finding new incentives, and many other things as well. And it involves recreating the trust between leaders and led, the different parts of a city. So therefore, finally, I just say, for many years I've been asked, what's the value of imagination? What's the value of culture? What's the value of creativity? What's the value of heritage? What's the value of green thinking? That made me feel always defensive, but I feel now liberated, because I always say to that person, what's the cost of you not thinking about creativity? What's the cost of you not thinking about culture? What's the cost of you not thinking about all those things? And that's been my real liberation, and that's perhaps my final message to you. So a lot of it is not about money, it's about mindset. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I think it's very inspiring to hear your thoughts. And it was a very broad talk that took us into many, many places. I think we should do a round of questions. We can start down here on the right. Is the mic? The mic is coming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richard. Actually, your presentation is very rich, and I prefer to talk in Arabic, if you allow me. So you can use the translator, please. حقيقة المحاضرة كانت please.
Sorry, can I just get...
Yeah, please. I'll let you wait. المحاضرة كانت جدا ثرية وعجبتني كثير من المصطلحات الحلوة مثل الجرين ثينكينج وأشياء كثيرة وردت في موضوع أنسنة المدن. وذكر المحاضر كلمة رائعة وحلوة اسمها الأنسنة تعني الدراما، وأنا أيضا أقول أن الأنسنة تعني الاستراتيجي. لا يمكن أنه ندير أو نتعامل مع أي موضوع يخص الأنسنة من غير ما نفكر في المانجمنت والاستراتيجي. أنا اشتغلت في خبرتي الماضية كخبير في الحياة الفطرية لمدة 30 عاما، وكان معظم عملنا خارج المدن في المناطق الجبلية والصحراوية. مرة من المرات رأيت رجل عجوز كبير في السن في أحد الوديان، يسكن في أحد الوديان طول عمره، فقلت له لماذا لا تذهب إلى المدينة وتعيش هناك؟ هناك أشياء حديثة ومستشفياتهم. فجاوبني جواب يعني صادم وصعب، قال إذا ذهبت إلى المدينة سوف أموت. هنا نقطة جدا مهمة، كيف نجعل المدينة ليست لأهلها ولكنها للجميع، هي لي وللحاضرين وللزائرين. معظم المدن الآن تعيش بلون واحد، كيف نجعل المدن ذات ألوان متعددة؟ بطبيعة الحال ذكر أنه يجب أن لا نأخذ كوبي من أي مدينة ونطبقها على مدينة المدينة أو أي مدينة أخرى. شيء طيب أن نأخذ كوبي، لكن we have to build our humanity and يعني لازم إحنا نعمل أنسنة المدينة التي بما نملك من قيم. الحمد لله الدين الإسلامي يحفظ بكثير من القيم، ربما بمقارنة مع الدول الأوروبية والأخرى بعض المفاهيم لا نجدها، كحق الجار والعلاقة بين الجيران والعلاقة بين الأبوين. ورسولنا صلى الله عليه وسلم أوصى بسابع جار، وحتى في الأشياء هذه حديث كثيرة تبين اللحمة المطلوبة. ليس يهمني أن تكون المدينة فيها بيئة صالحة، نباتات حلوة، طيور، فاسيلتي، شوارع مؤنسة، ولكن الناس البشر لا يتعارفون مع بعض ولا يندمجون. صعب أن أكون جاري 10 سنوات لا أعرف اسمه، هذا لا يعطي أي انطباع على شيء اسمه أنسنة المدن. لا أريد أن أطيل، ولكن نحن هذه رسالة أوجهها إلى القائمين على المؤتمر. نحن بحاجة إلى استراتيجية أنسنة المدن وليس أنشطة أنسنة المدن، لأنه الأنشطة المختلفة هي كخيوط العنكبوت تصل من السنتر إلى الأطراف، والأهم من هذا هو العلاقات البينية، الترابط البيني بين هذه الخيوط. هذا هو يسمى المانجمنت والاستراتيجي أوف humanizing city. وشكرا جزيلا.
Thank you. You want to try to reply?
No, I agree with you. It's fine.
I think
I agree with you. It's fine. Another question.
Can we?
And I have to ask to keep the questions a bit short, please.
Great.
Any other? There's one here in the front. Can we take the one in the middle here, please?
Microphone.
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله سيدنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم. المتحدث خليل عبد العزيز الحجيري، صاحب مكتب القبة الخضراء للاستشارات الهندسية. أتعاطف معك سيد تشارلز على تهجير والديك من بلدهم. أتمنى لك التوفيق. في بداية محاضرتك عندما أذن المؤذن توقفت ووجهت السؤال للقاعة: هل أتوقف؟ أقول لك: هدي المصطفى صلى الله عليه وسلم نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم أن يتوقف المرء ليستمع للأذان وبعد ذلك تستطيع أن تكمل الحديث. محاضرتك قيمة ورائعة، تتحدث عن المحبة، الحرص على الثقافة، المشاركة المجتمعية، التوازن، لنخرج بمدينة تتعامل مع الإنسان وذات أنسنة. لا أملك إلا أن أشكرك، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you for that. That was not really a question, but we can go to the next one.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Saad Al Saleh. Thank you very much, Mr. Charles, for your informative talking. I have a question regarding to, based on your long experience. I'm here. Yes. Based on your long experience, what is the best ways? I want just to know the best ways to engage the people to create a creativity public spaces.
Yeah, the question is what is the best key to engage the public in creating livable cities and creativity within the city in general?
There are obviously many techniques to engage people, but it's not about techniques. I think the mere fact that I don't know how much you have engaged the people, I have no idea, but just the mere fact that you would ask people what they think, what their ideas are, what their aspirations are, makes people feel much more, in a sense, committed and gives them the possibilities of pride of place. But it's also, you know, a lot of us are experts in something, but I've found that when you do talk to people and engage people in, let's say, community development processes, but this could also be businesses and other stakeholders as well, that I'm always finding that I'm learning from it. So what I've found is it's not sort of, oh, we've got this terrible problem of having to engage. I'm often feeling, hey, this is really an opportunity for me to also learn. I think there is a downside that's begun to happen in Europe, which is there's been a sort of clash happening, top down or bottom up, as if it's a black-white thing. No, it must be bottom up or it must be top down. Well, it's not a question of top down, bottom up for me. It's a question of finding out the balances between that. And that's what I think one has to be slightly wary of. The other thing that I think one should be wary of, some of these processes can be done in a way that they become too long-winded and too complex, and that does take time. So those would be my two comments on that. There was a guy in the front.
I think there's one on the left here.
Oh, let's take that guy. He was first.
We take one in the front here first.
Me? Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this informative lecture. Actually, I would like to ask, you know that we are actually competing with time now, especially with the merge of the Vision 2030 and all these initiatives that came out of the vision and the programs that are associated with the vision. And as mentioned yesterday, that one of the main initiatives is the humanization of Saudi cities. And my question here is, what would be your advice as a subject expert, as a subject matter expert for example, for the municipality of Medina to go about quick wins in creating and delivering projects, quick wins, and delivering projects that will have immediate impact for 2018, for 2018, and delivering spaces that are, or in humanizing spaces in Medina by the end of this year. This is number one question. Number two question is that if we were to come with policies out of this conference, what would be the one policy that you would suggest that we come up with for humanizing our spaces at the national, regional, and the local level? Thank you.
Well, what we're really talking about, because the humanizing cities thing really connects to the Vision 2030. So that's obviously helpful. And any city needs to have some sort of sense of where am I going, what do I want to be? You could call that a vision. That, and I think here the key question is there's a series of principles. Some of these will be Islamic principles, but there are other principles as well, which were effectively mentioned about things like people want to interact, and then questions of walkability. Some of these comments that were mentioned in the earlier session. So I'm thinking now till you're saying 6 months effectively, what can I do that's quick and makes a dramatic change? I think we're back to doing something that might just be a test, yeah? It doesn't need to be permanent, but just a bit along the Fred Kent line, where you can trial things and test things out, because if you're talking about that short time scale, it's not going to be a heavy physical infrastructure you're going to build. It's going to be something that is perhaps even impermanent, a bit like a stage set for a concert or something like that. And I would try and think through, how can I do something that's impermanent, that I can do quickly, that embodies my values, my principles that I'm trying to achieve about humanizing the city. And I would then perhaps get someone who might be artistically inspired involved as part of your group, simply to say, okay, our main question is humanizing cities, is making people interact, let's say, whatever your key priorities are. And that's what I would do, because if you were a business, yeah, you always have a research and development department, yeah? If you didn't have a research and development department, people would say, are you trying to go bankrupt? In city making, it's more difficult. That's why we need more experiments. And that's why these smaller scale things, your 6 months problem could be an opportunity.
I think we have to end very, very soon, but there's a lady here who has been waiting for a while, so I think we take that as the last one, please.
Okay, I'll make it very quick. Thank you very much for your very insightful lecture. My question is about the fast-moving pace that we're in. You mentioned that everything and everyone is on the move. There's a sense of anxiety that is kind of enveloping a lot of these cosmopolitan places just because we're constantly driven. And my question is regarding creativity and the contemplation aspect of it. Being able to center yourself, having a sense of calm. And if you could talk a little bit about the importance of that and where is its place in the city to kind of mitigate any of the damages that will be.
Well, we clearly know, and this was raised earlier, that the social media can fragment. We know that, and we know it's wonderful at the same time, but at the same time has dangers. We also know that historically, certainly in the Western world, creativity is often seen as, hey, it's lively, it's vibrant, it's all got to be innovated all the time, and so on. And that is a bit like a cliche, because it all depends on context. Creativity is context-driven. If the world is moving around and being too quick and mad and crazy, then the creativity is calmness. We saw the Siena Square, yeah, which is a classic icon of Europe. It was very creative that they did not destroy it, yeah? Lots of squares like that were destroyed. So the decision to say no was creative. So now, I think, given this question of fragmentation and people feeling a bit anxious, we need to use and remind ourselves that some forms of creativity are very soft. So, relate to giving us the opportunity to experience things in a slow way, yeah? There could be, instead of seeing a show that everything is so incredibly fast, it could be slower. And even you asking that question is already putting us on the right path. Do you see what I mean? By just posing that question, people in this room will come up with solutions to find, I don't know, projects or approaches to deal with what you're saying.
I'm very sorry, but we're simply running out of time.
I'm around all day.
Yeah, so I think we can continue the discussion afterwards. Both me and Charles will be here all day. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for Charles for the lecture.
Thank you very much, Prof. Landry. Thank you, Brick, for being our moderator for this session. It seems that we had a very interesting start from the beginning. All the sessions were really interesting. And you know, what proves it actually, that even though it's lunch break, nobody is moving, we are still sticking to our chairs. I would like to invite you to lunch break for now, but I would like to remind you at 1:30, we will have a very interesting also presentation. It will be presented by it will be presented by Terry Rismahirini, who is the mayor of Surabaya, Indonesia, and she is a pioneer in humanizing her city. So at 1:30 we will be with her. Now it's lunch. I would like to remind you also, with all these interesting sessions that we had, Fred Kent will be also teaching on the techniques of how to humanize spaces at 6 p.m. in his workshop. At the same time, we have another workshop talks about sustainability and humanization, and that is discussing Harvard way of putting, you know, humanization into the bath road. That is again into another workshop at 6 o'clock. Please, registrations are really, so far we are going about 60%. I think seats are very limited and we will be closing very soon. It's lunchtime. I won't hold you very much. Please have a very enjoyable lunch at 1:30. We'll see you soon. Thank you very much.